They called her the ghost of the third floor. Wrenna Callahan had worked in Ashford Meridian's accounting department for 6 years, and in that time, she had said perhaps 600 words in meetings. Total. She ate lunch alone at her desk, color-coded her spreadsheets by 8:15 every morning, and left at exactly 5:31 p.m. Never a minute later. Nobody asked her opinion. Not on the budget. Not on the merger. Not on which conference room smelled like burnt coffee. She was furniture that filed taxes. The man who ran Ashford Meridian was named Holt Ashcombe, and he had inherited the company from his father the way some men inherit a chin or a temper, without asking for it, and without knowing what to do with it once it arrived. Holt was 41, handsome in the specific way that photographs well in a navy suit, and utterly convinced that confidence was the same thing as competence. He filled rooms with his voice. He interrupted CFOs. He had, 6 months earlier, greenlit an acquisition of a failing logistics firm called Wrenna Freight against the advice of 3 separate consultants, because the deal felt right, and because the CEO of Wrenna had complimented his golf swing. Wrenna had seen the numbers on Wrenna Freight before anyone else did. She always saw the numbers first. It was, quietly, the only thing she was good at, and she was extraordinarily good at it. She had built a private model, on her own time, that traced the cash flow of the merger 18 months out. The model said the acquisition would drain Ashford Meridian's reserves by winter. She printed it. She put it in a folder. She brought the folder to a Tuesday leadership meeting and sat at the far end of the table, the way she always did, waiting for the moment when someone might ask her something. Nobody did. Holt spent 40 minutes describing his vision for synergy pathways, using a slide deck with a photo of a handshake on it. When the meeting ended, Wrenna's folder was still closed on her lap. She walked back to her desk, opened her laptop, and updated her spreadsheet instead. This might have gone on forever. The quiet woman, the invisible warning, the company sliding gently toward a cliff nobody could see because nobody was looking down except that. Wrenna had a habit that would end up mattering more than anyone expected. Every Friday, she sent a short internal memo to nobody in particular. It went to a distribution list called Finance Archive, a technical mailing list that existed for compliance reasons and that, as far as she knew, no living person actually read. She used it like a diary. She wrote down what she saw in the numbers, in plain, careful sentences, and she hit send. And she never expected a reply. She had been doing this for 4 years, when Wrenna Freight's largest client, a retail chain called Corvale Home Goods, quietly began pulling its shipping contracts. Holt didn't notice for 3 weeks, because Holt did not read shipping reports. He read headlines about himself. By the time the finance team flagged the revenue gap, Ashford Meridian was 72 days from a covenant default on its credit line, the kind of technical failure that lets a bank seize collateral, freeze accounts, and, in the worst case, force a company into involuntary bankruptcy. The board called an emergency session. Consultants were flown in from Chicago at a rate that would have made Wrenna wince if anyone had shown her the invoice. For 3 days, 12 people with expensive degrees built models trying to find $11 million that didn't exist. Holt sat at the head of the table looking, for the first time anyone could remember, like a man who understood that he might actually lose something. It was the interim CFO, a tired man named Desmond Pruitt, who had been with the company 19 years, who finally remembered the finance archive list. He remembered it because he'd once, by accident, opened one of Wrenna's Friday memos looking for a template, and been startled by how precise it was, how it read 3 months into the future like a woman reading a weather report. At PM on the 3rd night of the crisis, exhausted and out of options, he pulled up the archive and searched her name. 41 memos. He opened the one from April. It described, in 4 paragraphs, the exact mechanism by which the Wrenna acquisition would create a liquidity gap if a major client left, and it named Corvale Home Goods specifically as the highest risk account, because Wrenna had noticed, months earlier, that Corvale's own quarterly filings showed they were shifting to a competitor's regional warehouse. She had done this from her desk, using nothing but public filings and a spreadsheet, while eating a turkey sandwich. On a Friday afternoon that nobody remembered, Desmond didn't sleep. He read all 41 memos before sunrise. Every single one had been right. At a.m., he walked into Holt's office without knocking, which he had never done in 19 years, and put his laptop down on the desk, open to the April memo. "There's a woman in accounting who called this in April," he said. "Word for word. She's been calling everything for 4 years. We need her in this room in 10 minutes, and you need to actually listen this time." Holt read the memo twice. His face did something complicated, something between humiliation and the particular relief of a drowning man spotting a rope. "Who is she?" he said, quietly, and it was the first time in 6 years anyone at that company had asked that question with real intent behind it. Wrenna was at her desk at 7:40, 15 minutes before her usual start time. When Desmond knocked on the low wall of her cubicle, she looked up, startled. Nobody knocked on her cubicle wall. Nobody needed to, because nobody ever came. He asked her to bring her models to the boardroom. She asked if she should bring the folder from April too, the one from the Tuesday meeting 6 months ago, still sitting in her bottom drawer, unopened by anyone but her. He said yes. Bring everything. She walked into the boardroom 11 minutes later carrying a stack of folders in both arms. And for the first time in 6 years, every person at that table turned to look at her before she'd said a single word. She didn't perform. She didn't apologize for the silence of the last 6 months, though a small, human part of her wanted to. She simply opened the first folder, set it in front of Holt, and began to speak in the same plain, careful sentences she'd been writing to nobody for years. Except now, 12 people were actually listening and writing down every word. She laid out 3 moves. First, a short-term bridge, a receivables factoring arrangement with a lender she'd already identified, because she'd modeled this exact scenario as a hypothetical back in June. Out of habit, out of the same quiet compulsion that made her color-code spreadsheets nobody asked to see. Second, a renegotiation with the bank, using a covenant waiver structure she'd seen work at a company Ashford Meridian had once considered acquiring. She remembered the deal because she'd read the due diligence file for fun on a slow Friday 2 years earlier. Third, and this was the part that made Desmond put down his pen entirely, a plan to win back 40% of the Corvale volume within 90 days. Because she'd noticed, in a filing nobody else had bothered to read, that Corvale's new warehouse partner had a capacity ceiling that would force them to split shipments again by spring. It took her 14 minutes. Nobody interrupted her. Holt, who had never once in his tenure sat through 14 uninterrupted minutes of anyone else's voice, did not say a word until she was finished. "Why," he said finally, "did you never bring this to me directly?" Wrenna looked at him, not with anger, because 6 years of being invisible doesn't usually curdle into anger. It curdles into something quieter and sadder than that, and said, "I did. In April, I sat at that table with this exact folder. Nobody opened it." The room went very still. Desmond looked at his hands. A board member named Ilsa Thornberry, who had sat at that April meeting and remembered. Now, the closed folder on the far end of the table closed her eyes briefly. Holt didn't defend himself, and that, more than anything else, that week, was the thing that started to change him. He simply nodded once and said, "Then I'm asking now. Walk me through all of it, slowly, not leaving this room until I understand every page." They were in that boardroom for 6 hours. Wrenna talked, and for the first time, someone with the power to act actually did. The bridge financing closed 9 days later. The bank agreed to the covenant waiver after Wrenna herself sat in the negotiation, at Holt's specific insistence, because he'd learned expensively, and just in time, that the smartest person in the building was the one who'd been quietly saving it for years, unasked. By March, Ashford Meridian had recovered 31% of the Corvale volume, ahead of her own projection, because the warehouse capacity ceiling she'd spotted turned out to be even tighter than she'd modeled. Holt made her Director of Financial Strategy that spring, a title that didn't exist at the company until he invented it for her. But the thing that actually mattered to Wrenna, the thing she mentioned once quietly to Desmond over coffee, wasn't the promotion. It was smaller than that and larger. It was that Holt started reading her Friday memos, every single one, and when he had a question, he didn't send an assistant. He walked to the third floor himself, and he knocked. She still ate lunch alone sometimes. She still left at 5:31 quiet days. But now, when she spoke in a meeting, 12 people picked up their pens before she'd finished her first sentence. Because they had all learned, in the space of one October week, what it costs a company to let its quietest voice go unheard for 6 years, and what it's worth to finally listen. Nobody had asked the quiet girl in accounting for advice. They never made that mistake again.